Esther the Queen by William M. Taylor. 1. Introductory. The Book of Esther is one of 5 Old Testament books which were called by the later Jews, quote, Megilloth, end quote, the other 4 being the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. The name, quote, Megilloth, end quote, signifies rolls or volumes, and was probably given to these books because each was read in the synagogue on a special festival day, and was for convenience on such occasions written on a separate roll. Of the 5, that of Esther was the most highly esteemed, being sometimes styled simply, quote, Megillah, end quote, or the volume. It was read on the day of the Feast of Purim, and was elevated to a place above the other sacred books, except those of the Pentateuch. It has always been reckoned in the Old Testament canon, and is, quote, named or implied in almost every enumeration of the books comprising it, from Josephus downward, end quote. Moreover, the fact that 7 other chapters, additional to those in the Hebrew canon, have been relegated to the Apocrypha as unworthy of a place in Holy Scripture gives all the greater weight to those which are retained, and is an evidence that some discrimination was exercised by those on whom the decision of such a matter devolved. In modern times, objections have been raised against its canonicity, especially on 2 grounds. First, because it makes no mention of God, and second, because it breathes a spirit of narrowness and vindictiveness. Now, as regards the first of these, though we admit that it states a fact, we yet fail to see that it has any force in this connection. For in the book there is no indication of any such animus towards God, as would make the omission of his name significant either of antagonism or of contempt. It is quite possible that there might be, in a work that had no mention of God's name, such a spirit of irreverence and unbelief as to show that the absence of the divine name was meant to be a slight. But there is nothing of that in the book of Esther. For though the name of God is not in it, his hand is very manifest all through it, and the sense of his presence is made all the more vivid to the reader by the very silence of the writer. When Jesus, after his resurrection, met his followers at the Lake of Galilee, they were all sure that it was he, but, quote, none of them durst ask him, Who art thou? Knowing that it was the Lord, end quote. Their very certainty that it was he kept them silent. Similarly, this writer, whoever he was, takes it so thoroughly for granted that God's providence ordered the things that he records, that he does not think it needful to refer to it, and his silence is not that of unbelief, but of faith. Nay more, I am not sure but that he produces a deeper impression of God's minute overruling care over his people by his silence than he would have done by any words. An orator may gain his end in the hearts of his hearers in one or other of 2 ways. Either by going before them with an enthusiasm whose infection they are sure to catch, or by, as it were, keeping behind them and studiously holding himself from saying what they all feel that he ought, in consistency with his argument and principles, to say. In the latter case, when he ceases, his hearers go away exclaiming, quote, Why did he not go further, and declare that this or that should be done at once, end quote. But, as they thus speak, they are all unconsciously manifesting the very spirit which he designed to evoke in them. Now it is on the latter principle that the book of Esther is constructed, and its very silence concerning God provokes the reader to speak the more emphatically of the fact that his providence is so conspicuous in the history which it recounts. If that had been only once referred to by the writer, it would not have been nearly so frequently remarked on by the readers, and so a good object has been gained by the course which he has chosen. And, in any case, one who desired to palm off a production of his own for an inspired book would never have thought of keeping God's name out of his forgery. Indeed, as if to give point to this argument, the very first verse of the apocryphal additions to the book, which have been rejected as uncanonical, has this expression, quote, Then Mordecai said, God hath done these things, end quote. There is often a use of God's name when there is little regard for God himself, and sometimes they who know and love God best are most chary in the utterance of his name. The Scottish shepherd of the olden time always said, when referring to the will of the Supreme, quote, "It's his will," end quote. And the Waldensian traveller asked to be received simply, quote, "in his name," end quote. I do not know whether that was a more genuine piety, but I am sure that it was deeper than the modern variety, which has the most sacred appellations of the Eternal Father so frequently, I had almost said so flippantly, upon its tongue. And I cannot see, therefore, that the absence of God's name from such a book as we shall find this to be is any valid argument against its canonicity. As regards the second objection, namely, that it contains the record of the manifestation of a narrow and vindictive spirit, we may answer that the first indispensable quality of a history is that it be true, and therefore, if that narrowness of spirit were really there, it would have been false to convey the impression that it was not. Besides, the writer does not necessarily approve of that which he records, and we must not run away with the utterly absurd idea that the God of the Bible endorses everything which is narrated in the Bible. If we are to throw out of the Scriptures as uncanonical every account of such human doings as God must disapprove of, we shall make it a very fragmentary thing, and deprive it of much of its usefulness among men. For, before we get through with the exposition of this book, we may find that those very chapters in it, to which more especially this objection is made, are fraught with lessons of warning and reproof, which we might not have received, so forcibly at least, if these things had been omitted. We take the book of Esther, therefore, as canonical. We accept it as an integral part of those scriptures which Jesus has commanded us to search, and to which he gave his imprimatur when he said, quote, "The scriptures cannot be broken," end quote. But now the question arises, to what precise section of the history of the Jews in the time of the captivity or dispersion does this episode of Esther belong? And the answer to that depends on the settlement of this other, namely, who was the Ahasuerus, or, giving the name the form which it has in the original, the Ahasverosh of this book. In the first verse of the first chapter, it is said, quote, "This is Ahasuerus which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces," end quote. He was, therefore, emperor of Persia at the time of the widest extent of that imperial dominion. This at once determines that he could not be before Darius Hystaspes, by whom a portion of India was first annexed to the Persian Empire. The same thing is established by the fact that the royal residence is throughout the book at Susa, and it is well known that the palace there was first built by Darius. Therefore, no ruler prior to him will satisfy the conditions of the history. But neither can we identify Ahasuerus with Darius himself, for not to say that the character of Ahasuerus, as here depicted, is altogether inconsistent with what we know elsewhere of Darius, we find from other sources that in the 3rd year of his reign, Darius was still struggling to maintain his claim to the crown. Media was in revolt, and he himself was at Babylon, so that it would have been impossible for him, at that date, to hold a feast so extended and prolonged as that with the description of which the book of Esther begins. Again, this Ahasuerus cannot be Artaxerxes Longimanus, for it was in the 7th year of that monarch's reign that he issued the letter which Ezra carried with him to Jerusalem, and which indicates that he was well acquainted with the Jews and their peculiar laws, so that he cannot be the man to whom, in the 12th year of his reign, Haman is represented in this book as speaking of the Jews as if then for the first time they had been brought before his attention. Besides, the mild and humane qualities which come out in the patron of Ezra and Nehemiah are as far as possible from harmonizing with the characteristics of this Ahasuerus. But a later monarch than Artaxerxes Longimanus would be inconsistent with the genealogy of Mordecai, as given in Esther chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, so that we are reduced to the conclusion that the history belongs to the life of a Persian monarch between the reigns of Darius on the one hand and Artaxerxes Longimanus on the other, and that must be Xerxes, the son of Darius and the father of Longimanus, known in history as the unsuccessful invader of Greece. And he satisfies all the conditions of the case. For, first of all, the name Ahasverosh is the exact transliteration into Hebrew, consonant for consonant, of the Persian word Kasher-Ayasha, which is found in some cuneiform inscriptions that have been taken from Persepolis, and which the Greeks and Romans abbreviated into Xerxes. Again, in the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes assembled at Susa a great divan, preparatory to his invasion of Greece, corresponding to the feast here described. And in the 7th year of his reign, he returned to the same palace after his defeat, and gave himself up to the pleasures of his harem, facts which perfectly harmonize with the statements made and the dates given in the 2nd chapter of this book. Moreover, the Xerxes whom Herodotus portrays exhibits the very same fits of passion, caprice, and cruelty which are here attributed to Ahasuerus. Thus, when Pythias, the rich Lydian who had hospitably entertained the Persian army on its way to Greece, and had offered Xerxes an enormous sum to defray the expenses of the war, asked of him as a favour that the eldest of his 5 sons, who were all in the army, should be released from military duty and permitted to remain at home with him to be a comfort to his declining years, Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, in a rage, ordered that the young man should be put to death, and that his body should be cut in twain, and made his entire army march between the pieces. The same historian informs us that when his famous bridge over the Hellespont was broken up by a storm, Xerxes commanded that the engineers who had superintended its construction should be beheaded, ordered the sea to be scourged, and childishly thought to chain its waves by sinking a few fetters in its depths. He alleges also that after his return from his shameful defeat to Persia, Xerxes sought to solace himself by reveling in sensual pleasures, even though that involved the execution of some of his nearest relatives. Now, all these acts are so thoroughly in keeping with the arbitrary contempt for human feeling and human life which are ascribed to Ahasuerus in this book, that we have no difficulty in identifying the one with the other. But Xerxes began to reign in 486 BC and died in 465 BC, and so the place of this book in Jewish history is between the resumption of work on the temple by the returned exiles under Joshua and Zerubbabel, when Haggai and Zechariah prophesied, and the mission of Ezra to his countrymen, and it belongs chronologically to the long interval which elapsed between the things related in the 6th and those mentioned in the 7th chapters of the book of Ezra. This being the case, we can at once realize to ourselves the condition of the Jews at the time. The first installment of those who had returned to labor for the restoration of their nationality and worship had been now in Jerusalem for 53 years, contending for some of these with cunning and malignant adversaries. But the rest of the descendants of the captives had elected to remain in the cities of their dispersion, where they were kindly treated and fairly prosperous, and were not, it is to be feared, either so exalted in patriotism, so heroic in character, or so self-forgetting in piety as those of whom we read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But they were not neglected by their God. There was as real a providence in their remaining where they were as there was in the return of the others to their own land. For, if the latter prepared a Palestine for the appearance of the Messiah, the former made ready a means of communication between Jews and Gentiles against the coming of the time when the gospel should be preached by Jews to all nations under heaven. The scene of the story is from first to last in Shushan, or Susa, and it may be well, once for all, to give a description of the place. The site has been found in latitude 32 degrees, 10 minutes north, longitude 48 degrees, 26 minutes east, between the rivers Shafur and Dizful. It was originally the capital of the country called in Scripture Elam, and by the classical writers sometimes Kisia and sometimes Sus or Susiana. Its ruins cover a space about 6,000 feet long from east to west by 4,500 feet from north to south. The circumference of the whole is about 3 miles. They were explored in part in the year 1851 by General Williams, and the exploration was resumed in the following year by Mr. Loftus. Quote, "Coming from the west, the traveller crosses the Chapeau, a small stream flowing southward, and finds himself at the base of the smallest but loftiest," end quote, of the 4 mounds which now mark the site, quote, "its extreme altitude above the river being 119 feet, and the circuit at the summit 2,850 feet. This mound doubtless represents the citadel of Shushan. Close by, on the northeast, rises a considerable square mass of some 4,000 feet in circuit. Upon this have been discovered foundations of a magnificent hall of columns erected by Darius Hystaspes, consisting of 36 pillars arranged in rows of 6 each, and flanked on 3 sides at a distance of 63.5 feet by double rows of pillars, 6 in each row. To the southeast of these mounds, and separated from them by narrow valleys, is a great platform of 60 acres, which reaches elevations of from 40 to 70 feet, and is 3,000 feet long on the east side. These 3 mounds together form a diamond-shaped block, having its angles nearly to the cardinal points, and including above 100 acres of surface." End quote. More recently, the explorations begun by General Williams and Mr. Loftus have been laboriously prosecuted by Monsieur Dieulafoy. These have been described by Madame Dieulafoy in an article published in Harper's Magazine for June 1887, and by Monsieur Dieulafoy himself in a lecture before the Société des Études Juives in Paris, April 1888, of which a translation has appeared in the Bibliotheca Sacra for October 1889. The plan of the palace is given by him in the accompanying illustration, which will be made more intelligible by the following extracts from the lecture itself. Quote, "The palace was composed of 3 groups of distinct apartments, each surrounded by a special enclosure, but included within the same fortress. The Apadana, or throne room, resembled in its arrangement, and by its hypostyle architecture, a Grecian temple. The king occupied in the tabernacle the place of the statue of the deity. The hall at Susa covers nearly a hectare, between 2 and 3 acres. The porticos, the stairways, the enclosures were spread out upon a terrace, the area of which was 18 times as large, and was divided into 2 parts by a pylon. On one side, a gigantic stairway led to the outside parade on a level with a wide esplanade. On the other side, sparkling in its crown of emeralds, overshadowed by the foliage of a hanging garden, was the Apadana, where was received the ambassadors of all the states of Greece. The private apartments of the sovereign were distant from the Apadana, and grouped around an interior court, with the hall of audience, bedrooms, apartments appropriated to the Chancellor's office, to the military house, to the guard, to the dependents. In modern Persian, this part of the palace is called the Birun, exterior, in contrast to the Anderun, interior harem, reserved for the women. The Anderun comprises the apartments of the queens, and quite a large number of cells for the concubines of second rank, and for the postulants for the royal favours. The master of this department is not so much the king as the grand eunuch. The Anderun of Susa, walled, padlocked, and more tightly closed, I speak only from a constructive point of view, than even the most rigorous prison, is protected by the buildings of the Birun and the Apadana. The last 2, recognizable in the accompanying plan by their separation, and by the tower, keep, connected with the private dwelling of the king, occupy the 2 branches of a gigantic L, whose transept was reserved for the women's apartments. Leaving the Anderun by the west door, one would step out directly into the gardens of the Apadana. Walking towards the south, one would cross the Birun. The palace had numerous entrances. I will mention the fortified gate of the king's house, and the gate of the general enclosure which opened to the south of the tower, and was the means of communication between the Acropolis and the city of Susa." End quote. It was, according to Monsieur Delafoy, at this gate that Mordecai was wont to sit, and it was in the Apadana that the banquet described in the first chapter of the book of Esther was held. It is interesting to add that, although he speaks of the legend of Esther, Monsieur Delafoy has declared that, quote, "the excavations at Susa not only confirm the architectural descriptions of the book of Esther, but even the smallest details of the story," end quote, and affirms that, quote, "the epoch in which the Hebrew version of the book was written may be fixed in the 4th century BC, end quote, and that, quote, "it was written honestly at Susa by a Susian Jew, and goes back for its Hebrew compilation to this side of the accession of Artaxerxes Mnemon, and far beyond the Parthian conquest," end quote. The importance of these details, both for the illustration and defense of the book, must be my apology for the length of the quotations which I have made. As to the authorship of the book, nothing certain can now be determined, but some have supposed that the 20th and 21st verses of the 9th chapter, which say, quote, "Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, to establish this thing among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same year yearly," end quote, are equivalent to an assertion that Mordecai was the author. The reference of these verses, however, is to the establishment of the Feast of Purim, and they are too narrow a foundation on which to build the inference that he wrote the whole book, however otherwise probable that may have been. Others have ascribed its production to Ezra, and others still to Joachim, the high priest. But these are only guesses, as also is the opinion of Rawlinson that, quote, "it was written by a younger contemporary of Mordecai, who put the facts on record towards the middle of the reign of Artaxerxes Longimanus, when they were in danger of being forgotten by the passing away of the generation that had witnessed them," end quote. The writer has kept his own name, as such, out of his book, as well as the name of God. For what reason he has done so, or who he was, or in what circumstances he wrote, all these are equally unknown. But the book itself is not discredited any more than is the Epistle to the Hebrews, by its being anonymous, for it bears throughout the marks of its veracity. As we have seen, the name Achashverosh is the exact transliteration into Hebrew of the Persian name of Xerxes. Its chronology harmonizes exactly with that elsewhere given of the early years of that monarch's reign, and his character as depicted here is precisely parallel with that which comes out in other histories of his doings, while the descriptions of the manners and customs of the Persian court are so minute and so accurate as to convey the impression that the story in which these occur is thoroughly authentic. It is indeed true that we have no direct confirmation of the narrative from profane history, but no other book treats of the same times in such a way as to come into comparison with it. As Rawlinson has said, quote, "no contradiction is to be found between it and the established facts of history. On the contrary, the narrative is in harmony with those facts, completes very happily the portraiture of Xerxes and his court, agrees with but goes beyond the descriptions of Persian life and manners which have otherwise come down to us, has the air of being by a contemporary, and, if untrue, might have easily been proved to be untrue at the time when it was published, by reference to the extant Book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia, which it quotes," end quote. Nor must we forget that the Feast of Purim has been observed by the Jews annually from the very time of the occurrences which are here recorded down to our own days, and is thus, to the incidents of the book of Esther, what the Passover is to the Exodus, or the Lord's Supper to the Passion of our Saviour. On the whole, therefore, we conclude that though the author of this book is unknown, its credibility and canonical authority are thoroughly established, that the facts which it records occurred in the reign of Xerxes, otherwise known to us as the unsuccessful invader of Greece, that its chronological place among the books of the Bible is after Daniel and the first 6 chapters of Ezra, and that it narrates the history of an important crisis in the experience of the Jews of the dispersion, just 16 years before Artaxerxes issued the letter which Ezra carried with him to the governors beyond the river, and 29 years before Nehemiah exchanged for a season his post of cupbearer in the palace of Shushan for that of restorer and governor of Jerusalem. We have thus taken our historical bearings, and may now intelligently proceed to the exposition of the book itself. But we cannot enter upon that now, and we conclude these preliminary statements with Matthew Henry's somewhat quaint, yet very pertinent and pithy summary to this effect. Quote, "It is the narrative of a plot laid against the Jews, to cut them off, and wonderfully disappointed by a concurrence of providences. The most compendious exposition of it will be to read it deliberately altogether at one sitting, for the latter events expound the former, and show what providence intended in them. The particulars are not only surprising and very entertaining, but edifying and very encouraging to the faith and hope of God's people in the most difficult and dangerous times. We cannot now expect such miracles to be wrought for us as were for Israel when they were brought out of Egypt, but we may expect that in such ways as God here took to defeat Haman's plot, he will still protect his people. The whole story confirms the psalmist's observation. The wicked plotteth against the just, and gnasheth upon him with his teeth. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeth that his day is coming." End quote.